In this video, we're going to be working through assignment 9.4, number 1 and 2. The object here is to write examples where you have successive or adjacent first inversion chords. Like here we have two chords with 6. We know that's a first inversion chord. And here's another example with two chords in a row that are labeled 6. The pitfall when you have that is that it's very easy to have parallel octaves. And so one thing we're going to be keeping aware of is that when we go to doubled notes, we try to use contrary motion or at least oblique motion going to the doubled note, but not parallel motion. So if you have a note here and a note here and it's going to a doubled note by contrary motion, you won't have parallel octaves. If you have a note starting here and a note starting here and they go to the doubled note by oblique motion, you can't have parallel octaves. But it would be possible if these two voice parts were an octave apart and they go to the doubled note in similar motion, it would be possible to have parallel octaves, something that is considered undesirable in this kind of chorale style part writing. So we'll look for the type of motion used going to the doubled notes in our examples. Another pitfall we want to make sure we avoid is that when you have a dominant chord that we don't double the leading tone. The leading tone is considered the most active chord tone. It's I like to say it's toxic, so you don't want to double it. It's already hot enough. You don't need to stress it anymore. All right, our first example is in the key of G major, 1 sharp, and by looking at the bass lines where there are root position chords, G in the bass is going to be a tonic chord, and another G in the bass here is going to be a tonic chord. We have to do a little thinking when we have a first inversion chord. My quick trick for first inversion chords is to go down a third. Let me just zoom in here for a second. Can I zoom in? There we go. Okay, so when you have a note, if you go down to the space below it or the line below it, when you go down a third, you will get the root of a first inversion chord. So whenever a chord has 6 underneath it, just go down to the next space if it's a space note, or go down to the next line if it's a line note, and that'll tell you what the chord is. So this is, for instance, going to be a C chord. That's the space below it. And this is going to be a D chord. That's the space below it. All right, let's zoom back out, though, and do this again. I'm going to clean up my work here and go back to the smaller zoom. All right, so G major, and we have a tonic chord here, we had a tonic chord here, but we determined that this is a C chord, so that's the subdominant 6, and this is a D chord, that's the dominant 6 in this key. All right, well, let's start with putting our tenor on the D that we need. Right? We have a G in the bass, and we have a B in the soprano, but we need a D. And then we need a doubled note. We need the root of this chord doubled, so we need another G, and that's what our alto is going to have. All right, going to the next chord, we would like to double the soprano. That's the first inversion doubling is to double the soprano note. Can we do it? Well, let's see. If we put the C in the tenor, we are going to be using oblique motion going to that doubled note, so we know we won't have any parallel octaves. So that's a good thing to do. And then the only note left is the G in the alto. So there's our C, E, G subdominant chord, but in first inversion. All right, so we'll go to the next chord. Can we double the soprano? Well, let's talk about if we doubled the bass. If we put an F sharp in the bass, say, then we would be doubling the leading tone, right? In the key of G, F sharp is the leading tone. That's what I was describing as a toxic event. We don't want to have two leading tones, so we definitely don't want to do that. We could actually double the soprano, and again, using oblique motion going to that D, we will be sure not to have parallel octaves. So we'll keep the D in the alto, and then the missing note, the A, we will put in the tenor. So that's a D, F sharp, A chord, a chord in first inversion. Right, dominant 6. And now the final tonic chord, I'm going to double the bass and the tenor, once again thinking about oblique motion to get to that double note, and I'm going to just keep the alto on D. All right, so that's an example of good part writing and avoiding having any parallel octaves by being aware of the oblique or contrary motion, preferring that rather than parallel motion. Another option to avoid those things is simply to have the doubling be different than doubling the soprano. Let's look at the second one now on assignment 9.4. and it's also in the key of G major. And let me move that over a little bit. Whoops, lost my, there we go. Okay, let's label the key here, G major, and then tonic here, and tonic here. And it's also subdominant 6 to dominant 6. It's the same bass line, so that is not different. It's the soprano line that has changed. And I think I'm going to start with my alto a little bit lower. Alright, so we have a G, we have a B, and we have a D. We have all 3 chord tones, then we just need to think about doubling. And let's double the G and the tenor. Okay, going to the next chord, normally I would double the soprano, but I kind of don't want to have the tenor leap up to a C. I'm going to keep it on G. Now I have a C, an E, and a G, and I'm going to have the alto go up to the E. So that's an unusual doubling, but it's still, you know, doubling the third in the bass is an unusual doubling, but it's okay. That's an exception. If it's not something you always do, it's okay. And then for the dominant chord, here's the root of the dominant. We need a D. Well, the alto was close, so I'll put the D in the alto. And we need another A would be doubling the soprano, which is the normal doubling that you use for first inversion chords. So let's look at our doubled notes here in terms of going to the A, right? Going to the double note, oblique motion. Or I'm sorry, in this case, contrary motion. That's great. Okay, and then to our final chord, to this tonic chord, let's double the bass and tenor on the G and keep the D in the alto. So that would be at least one of several acceptable ways to part write the this example that includes 2 successive first inversion chords. And notice that when we had that, this was an example where we used an unusual doubling. Instead of doubling the soprano, we doubled the bass. In the second example, we did the normal doubling. We doubled the soprano.